They said the night he arrived. Even the hounds refused to bark, as if something in his silence unsettled creatures long trained to fear nothing on earth. The carriage wheels cracked against the gravel path of Willowmarsh Plantation, cutting through the August humidity like a blade. Lanterns flickered in the wind, casting wavering halos across the veranda where Mistress Eleanor Vance stood waiting, her ivory-gloved hands clasped tightly together. She had spent more money that summer than her late husband ever would have allowed. But this was her boldest purchase yet. The most handsome enslaved man ever brought through the inland markets. The auctioneer's words, repeated so many times the town gossips stitched them into their daily conversations. A man whose face could make a woman forget her own name, they whispered. But beauty alone did not explain the rest of the whispers. The strange rules demanded by the trader, the warning that came with his papers, and the claim that no buyer had kept him longer than a season. Eleanor dismissed those rumors, as people like her often did when confronted with truths that clashed against their sense of control. She stepped forward as the carriage door swung open. He emerged slowly, one foot bare, then the other. His ankles were chained, but the weight of iron didn't seem to bend him. Instead, he stood tall, shoulders squared, eyes focused ahead without hesitation. His skin glistened with humidity, but he did not blink the sweat away. He didn't move unless he intended to. He looked carved, not born. Composed, not broken. His name, the trader had said, was Callum. Eleanor felt her breath tighten the moment she saw him. Not because of his beauty, though it was undeniable, but because he looked at her the way a man looks at a storm forming on the horizon, assessing, measuring, calculating what might come next. It was not fear. It was not obedience. It was something else entirely. Something she couldn't name but felt deep in her bones. "Welcome to Willowmarsh," she said, forcing a gracious smile even as her voice betrayed the tremble beneath it. He did not speak, but he bowed his head just enough to avoid offense. Then he followed the overseer without resistance, though every movement suggested that he allowed himself to be led, not that he could be forced. Days passed, then weeks. Callum worked quietly, steadily, never too fast, never too slow. He spoke to no one unless spoken to. He never cried out under heat or hunger. He never fought, never complained, never reacted. But Willowmarsh Plantation reacted to him. Strange things began to happen. The horses that bolted from the overseer's whip would calm the moment Callum approached. Tools misplaced for years were found exactly where the workers needed them. A water well that had been foul for months ran clean again after Callum spent an afternoon sitting nearby, silently coiling rope. Some slaves believed he was blessed. Some believed he was cursed. The overseer believed he was trouble. Eleanor was not sure what to believe, but she could not look away from him. At night, she found herself wandering to the window overlooking the quarters, her candle trembling in her hand as she watched him sit alone beneath the old hanging oak. He never slept more than a few hours. Sometimes he simply stared up at the branches, unmoving, as if waiting for something to fall from the darkness. She convinced herself her interest was harmless curiosity. She was wrong. One humid evening, she saw something she could never explain. Lightning crawled across the sky, illuminating the fields in brief flashes of blue. Callum stood at the edge of the cotton rows, completely still as the air around him shifted like a slow exhale. The storm's wind circled him without touching him. Cotton leaves trembled. The branches of the oak bent as if they recognized him. Eleanor gasped and stepped back from the window, knocking her candle to the floor. The flame guttered out instantly. The silence that followed felt impossible, as if the world itself paused. The next morning, the overseer stormed into her parlor, face twisted with rage. "That man is unnatural," he spat. "He's making the others restless. They think he's some kind of spirit. Last night the fields." He stopped talking the moment Callum himself appeared behind him in the doorway, silently carrying a basket of figs Eleanor hadn't asked for. His eyes flickered to her just once before lowering. If he heard the overseer's insults, he showed no sign of it. He simply placed the basket on the table and walked out. But that moment changed something in Eleanor. She felt it deep inside, like a door creaking open. Over the next month, the plantation mistress began inventing reasons to speak to him. She asked about the harvest, though she barely cared for farming. She asked about the well, though she had a staff for that. Callum always answered politely, but his gaze never softened, never invited closeness. It was as if he carried an invisible weight that kept the world at arm's length. The more she tried to understand him, the more he became a mystery. Then the first real incident occurred. On a blistering afternoon, the overseer whipped a young boy for dropping a crate, a punishment far too harsh for a clumsy mistake. Callum stepped forward, placing himself between the boy and the lash. He didn't raise a hand. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there. The overseer froze, whip in midair. Callum's voice, when he finally spoke, was low, smooth, almost gentle. "You will not do that again." The overseer stepped back as though struck. Something behind Callum's tone, something quiet and ancient, seemed to wrap around the man's throat. Eleanor witnessed the whole thing from the veranda. For the first time since buying him, she felt fear. Not of Callum's strength, nor his silence, but of the possibility that she had brought something into her home she could neither command nor understand. That night, she dreamed of him standing beneath the hanging oak again, staring at the branches as though expecting judgment. And she felt a truth rising like a shadow behind her ribs. Callum had not come to Willowmarsh as a victim. He had come with purpose. And whatever that purpose was, it was beginning to unfold. The next morning, she found something on her doorstep. A single withered rope knot, the kind once used for executions, placed carefully on her welcome mat. No one on the plantation would admit to leaving it. But Callum was standing at the far end of the yard, watching her with an expression she could not decipher. And for the first time, Eleanor wondered if his revenge had already begun. The question was simple, but terrifying. Revenge for what? The plantation held secrets. And Callum, somehow, seemed to already know them. The truth would come soon. Too soon, but not before something irreversible swept through Willowmarsh like a quiet, rising tide. By the time autumn reached Willowmarsh, the air had taken on a chill that never fully settled on Callum's skin. He moved through the plantation like a shadow that the world could see, but no one could catch. The others watched him the way frightened sailors watch a quiet sea, knowing calmness often hides a storm far more dangerous than waves. Eleanor tried to push aside the memory of the rope knot she had found on her doorstep. She convinced herself it was a prank, a misunderstanding, anything other than what her instincts whispered in the dark. Yet every time she saw Callum, her breath faltered. Not because he threatened her, but because he carried an awareness that made her feel exposed, as though he already knew the doors she kept locked inside her own mind. He began appearing in places she didn't expect, passing her carriage before sunrise, standing near the trellis when she returned from town, watching the horizon from the far field as if waiting for someone, or something, to arrive. One evening, as the sun melted into the trees, Eleanor found herself wandering to the old family cemetery near the edge of the property. Her late husband, Nathaniel Vance, rested beneath the grandest stone, a towering slab carved with angels and laurels. The other graves were older, some crumbling, some sinking into the earth like fading memories no one bothered to preserve. She knelt beside Nathaniel's grave, brushing leaves from the engraving. "You left me with a place full of ghosts," she whispered, though she didn't know why the words slipped free. A twig snapped behind her. She spun, heartbeat leaping, and froze. Callum stood a few paces away, silent, watching her with an expression she could almost describe as recognition. She rose slowly. "What are you doing out here?" He didn't answer immediately. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the dead leaves around his feet. When he finally spoke, the sound of his voice seemed to merge with the hush of the forest. "This place remembers things," he said, "even when people forget." Eleanor swallowed. "And what is it you think this place remembers?" He stepped closer, not threatening, not deferential, simply present. "Names," he said softly. "Dates. Buried truths." The words cut through her like a blade. "How would you know anything about that?" she demanded. But Callum didn't explain. He only lowered his gaze to the earth, to the soft